Welcome back to another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast, the podcast that talks about what informs our faith and how our faith forms us. My name's Travis Jameson, and I'm your host. Have you ever wondered, what does it mean for a Christian to navigate the political landscape of our day faithfully? How do we do it in a way that reflects the God we worship to the world around us? I think this is a more important question now than maybe ever before. We're living in polarized times where it's difficult to have conversations even about politics. Well, on today's episode of the podcast, I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Gayle Doornbos, not only about her story of becoming a theologian, but as well as her work on the theological works of Abraham Kuyper and Herman Bavinck, and how she thinks they can help Christians faithfully navigate the political landscape of our day. Now, I'm not promising we're going to have all the answers on how to be a faithful Christian in politics today, but I do think that this conversation gives some cues for what it means to live well as a Christian, to love well as a Christian, even when we're faced with what we would call our political opponents. So stay tuned for my conversation with Gayle Doornbos. Dr. Gayle Doornbos, she is an Associate Professor of Theology at Dordt University. She brings a wealth of academic achievements and practical experience to her role with a doctorate from St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto, focusing on Trinitarian theology, as well as degrees in philosophical theology and biblical studies from Calvin Theological Seminary. She's had an extensive career teaching in academic and church communities across Michigan, Washington, and Canada. At Dordt, Dr. Doornbos is passionate about witnessing the profound impact of Scripture and theology on her students' faith and lives. She is teaching her students to engage deeply with theology, fostering transformation and enrichment that extends into all facets of their lives, inspiring them to actively participate in God's world. And I've experienced this firsthand because I had Dr. Doornbos as one of my own professors at Calvin Seminary back when I was there. So, Gayle, thank you for being on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me and for that very kind introduction.
You're welcome. That. It's great to have you here.
Feels like a different person or too much to live up to, but it is wonderful to be here.
Well, as our listeners need to get to know you a little bit, I wonder if you can tell us a bit about your story. And the way I ask this is, who were the people, where were the places, and what were the things that really influenced you, especially in your 0 to 18, your early years? What shaped you as a person?
Wow, that's a question that could have a very long answer. So I'm going to try to make sure that it doesn't take us the entire length of the podcast. My early life was really shaped by the community that I grew up in, which is the case with most people. But I grew up in Rehoboth, New Mexico, which was started way back in the early 1900s by the Christian Reformed Church as kind of a classical mission compound place. I mean, if you read about colonial missions and colonial style missions, that's what the Christian Reformed Church was participating in back in the early 1900s. And they went there to do mission work among the Native Americans, the Navajo and the Zuni. By the time I was there, because I wasn't born in the early 1900s, a lot had changed to reconcile with one another, to proclaim the goodness of the gospel, acknowledge the mistakes of the past, the challenges that had come through some of those missionary practices, but really come to the place where it was like, let's live and work together, declaring the goodness of the gospel while also telling the truth about our history. And I think that particular place shaped me in so many different ways. One, I think I was very aware early on of the beauty of Christianity, but also some of its sides that could be less beautiful, the places where we still see broken humanity doing things that they are hoping are good, but could be, when we look back on things, misconstrued or construed as harmful. So I think that shaped me in a very particular way. It gave me an eye for the diversity of Christianity, the ways in which it can be practiced. But then also my own ecclesial environment growing up was really rich, filled with all sorts of different people, different kinds of voices, but also profound care. So a big part of my story, I'm a pastor's kid. My dad was a pastor in New Mexico, but big part of our story is that my younger brother, who's about 2.5 years younger than me, was born with significant mental and physical disabilities and was in and out of the hospital, I would say 25 times before he was 2, with 5 major surgeries. Yeah. And we lived in the northwest corner of New Mexico, and the major hospital was 2 hours away. So they were making trips back and forth all the time to go to the hospital. And in the midst of that, the chaos that can bring to the life of a family, the church was really the place that cared for us. They brought us meals. They took care of me. They were really the literal hands and feet of Christ in my life. And so I think growing up in that environment, I got this sense of, this is a beautiful thing. The church is a beautiful thing, even amidst the acknowledgement of there are ways in which the church in that particular place had done great harm. It was still also a beautiful thing, bringing beautiful news and beautiful practices to the lives of the people who are part of it and the lives of the people who are outside of it. And for me and my family, it was definitely the care that the church brought me. And I think that early on really formed me to be really curious about what it would look like to give my life to serving God in and through the work of the church. And that's brought me through a long, meandering path to academic life. But I still feel very deeply connected, even in the life of the academic, to the questions that the church is asking, the struggles that it's going through, how it grapples with its past and its present. Those things, I think, have been really formative to me. So that's the place.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Was there a certain time when you were when you would say you kind of learned about the Christian Reformed Church's history with missions in New Mexico, and started to kind of reckon with the colonial nature of that? Because I think that is an important thing to wrestle with as 21st century Christians and the missionary past that many denominations have. And I think that's really cool that you were able to identify that. So at what point did you start to learn about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I would say it was in phases.
Yeah.
And those phases also were appropriate to the kinds of ages that I was. So I think early on, growing up there, I probably didn't have a huge view to it. Besides for the ways in which the school was really working to become, I think they call it the title at Rehoboth School now is vigorously academic, beautifully diverse. And so really just being a part of that beautiful diversity. And I think there was already a starting movement to appreciate the diversity and the beautiful diversity of what that looked like. When I was in 3rd grade, we actually moved from New Mexico to Michigan. And I think in some ways, even though I probably wasn't as cognizant of it, moving from a much more diverse context to what was much more monocultural, it was a small Dutch pocket in West Michigan. I think that probably got me started thinking about diversity, in my 3rd grade brain, but also sort of seeing the different kinds of questions that the church was grappling with, or the ways in which it was thinking about what does this look like? I think I got more of a sight. I moved back to New Mexico when I was 16, and probably got more of a sight then of, how do you grapple with this history? And I think that there was a real intentional grappling with that actually in and through the choir, which sounds maybe strange, but I think one of the things that really came through from the choir director, and then the ways in which the choir was trying to integrate different kinds of music and appreciate the past. I think actually that was one of the places that I started grappling with it most intellectually, as more of an like in an adult way. Kids grapple with these things in their own way. But I think one of those things fascinating is when I was there, one of the practices was sort of to shut down any sort of native language. So no speaking in Navajo, and the shutting down of, cultural practices like singing, and particularly Native American chants and these kinds of things that were really a part and parcel of the ways in which people live their lives and the cultural identity of various tribes, and practices and stuff like that. And one of the things that was really fascinating was when I was there in high school, they set Amazing Grace to the tune of a Navajo chant, and it was done in and through a collaborative process. And so I think that was part of the ways of thinking through what does it look like in a context where we live together and we are drawn into the new family of God that he's done by the work of his Spirit. And yet we still have these cultural goods to give. And now what does it look like to look at them as gifts rather than as things that must be stripped before coming into faith? And so that was probably one other place where I really started to wrestle with it. And then I also wrestled with it in my doctorate because I was taking an ecclesiology class, a missional ecclesiology class. And we were in the midst of going through and talking about colonial style missions as if everything that we were talking about happened over there across the ocean. And it was a really weird moment to just be like, I mean, these mission compounds that we are describing, I grew up in one, the remnants of one. It wasn't still the same thing, but it was just a fascinating thing to then wrestle with it at an academic level, with that level of, kind of awareness of what it looks like to live in the midst of that, rather than just treat it as an abstracted academic idea of something that happened a long time ago overseas.
And I don't know a whole lot about Rehoboth, even though, the Christian Reformed Church has been there a long time. Was the reason you were there, like your dad, was he pastoring the church there? Is there one church? Is there more than one church?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is two churches in that area that are CRC. One is the Rehoboth Christian Reformed Church, which is in Rehoboth and is the original church, I believe, that was started when missionaries started to go down there. There's another church in Gallup, which is right next door, Bethany Christian Reformed Church. And then there's also a Christian Reformed Church in Zuni, which is on the Zuni reservation. And I don't know the history of when each one of those started. But yeah, my dad was the pastor of Rehoboth Christian Reformed Church, which is on the old mission campus, is what it was called. And there used to be a hospital and a post office and a church and a school, and a few of those things remain. There's still a post office, at least to my knowledge. The hospital's moved off and is in Gallup now and is part of a different system, again, to the best of my knowledge. And then there's still the church and the school are still in that same area.
Okay. Wow. Well, thanks for sharing that. I think that kind of gives it's so helpful, I find, to learn about people's background, because even just the way you connected that to your doctoral studies and seeing that, like, this is, theological work is not something that is done in the ivory tower. It's always connected to the lived experience of the theologian in some way, and the context. And I think that must have been a real gift to not only you, but also your classmates and professors to be able to talk about that from a personal experience. I mean, that's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. I always say theology isn't driven by biography, but it is the occasion within which we ask the deep questions of life.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I think that there's something to the reality of saying this is how life is lived and experienced, and here's my experiences, but they are not unique and individual, but they are the occasion out of which these questions arise, I think. And that's when I love the idea of sort of that classical sense of faith seeking understanding. And some of that is understanding who is God, who is this God who has come to me in Christ by the power of the Spirit. But I think it's also, how does my faith engage with the life that I've lived and the ways in which humans interact and the ways in which the church is both this beautiful reality and bride of Christ, and yet filled with brokenness. So yeah, I think that it has been, I found myself more and more as I get into the work of, it always feels weird to say like being a theologian, because it can sound very ivory tower-esque. But really, I think the best of it is, and this is what I love about the Neo-Calvinist tradition and the Reformed tradition as a whole, is I had a professor who described it as like the Calvinists are the people who at the end of the day have their fingers dirty because they've been playing in creation all day long. But I also think about that in relation to theology. Like, it's not just about the things of this world, but it's about having our fingers dirty in the realities of life and saying, where does God meet us here? How does his revelation in Christ matter to the community that I grew up in, to the community I'm a part of now, and the questions that we're grappling with, which sometimes are perennial questions, but are arriving in a maybe novel context.
Yeah, I love that. Could you define the difference? Because I think this would be helpful for our listeners. So when someone says Calvinism, like, what do they mean by that? What do you mean by that? And then when you say Neo-Calvinism, because I've those terms get thrown around a bit, but I think it might be confusing as well. Why the neo? What's the difference?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and we could probably spend an entire other podcast on people's definitions of what Calvinism is.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but I think most broadly, Calvinism finds its roots back in the Reformation and following broadly the teachings of Calvin and those who follow him. And so it gets kind of lumped in as, oh, this is a Calvinist or a Reformed. Sometimes those words are used interchangeably and coterminously. And that's, I think, the broader tradition of Calvinism or Reformed is this broad tradition that goes back and has its historical roots in the Reformation and then particularizes itself around this one person. And then there's theological commitments and ecclesial commitments that come alongside of that. Neo-Calvinism, as I'm using it, is more of a specific reference to a revival of Calvinism in the 19th century in the Netherlands, led by people like Abraham Kuyper or Herman Bavinck. And they really are working to appreciate and live within the tradition of Calvinism as they've received it. And yet trying to say, how do we make this tradition applicable to our day? And what does it look like to live within this tradition, but yet make it appreciate some of the insights that have come from philosophical insights of the day, and yet be faithful to this tradition. And so it's a real movement that tries to update Calvinism. But it's also broader than just an ecclesial movement. It's not just about the church or theology for them. For Abraham Kuyper and Herman Bavinck, they see in Calvinism, going back to the Reformation, this kernel of saying God's work matters for all of life. What does it mean if Christ is Lord over everything? That God is sovereign over the entirety of life. And so what does it mean to be a Christian in every sphere in which I enter? So it's both a theological movement, an ecclesial renewal movement, but it's also a social movement, an ethical movement that tries to say, here's a huge view of what it means to be a Christian in this world. And that's when I say Neo-Calvinism, that's the movement that I'm usually referring to.
That's really helpful. And when when you think about Kuyper and Bavinck wanting this renewal of Calvinism, can you speak a little bit to the context of, because as far as I'm aware, there was the state church at the time in the Netherlands. They were becoming unhappy with it. Like it was kind of becoming, I don't know if it was plateauing or becoming um, complacent, but they were looking to revive not only theology and Reformed theology, but the church itself. Is that correct?
Yeah, and so there's a lot of movements in Dutch ecclesial life in the 1900s or the 1800s, the 19th century. And there's a lot of movement that starts to happen. And that's already starting at the very beginning of the 19th century before both Bavinck and Kuyper are
Mm.
born. And so there's already a split from the Dutch National Church in 1834. This is going to get us into the weeds, but that's okay.
That's all right.
There's already a church split in 1834 off of the Dutch National Church by a group that is unhappy with some of the modernization. They're unhappy with the fact that the church has ostensibly become a state church rather than a confessional church within the context of the state, which is a change that's made in 1816. So Bavinck is born into that church, the church that seceded in 1834 in what's known as the Afscheiding. And so Bavinck is already within that context, and there's movements to try to revitalize Dutch Christian faith and life, and particularly there's a lot of debates too in the 19th century about what is reformed. And there's a lot of claims around that. What does it mean to be reformed? And so the Neo-Calvinist stream is really one stream of saying this is what it means to be reformed.
Yeah.
And then later on, Kuyper also leads a group of churches out of the Dutch National Church, again, sort of upset and unhappy with the direction that the Dutch National Church is going and wanting to really revitalize faith and practice and thinking through what does it mean to be reformed in this particular context, a revitalization around the commitment to the confessions. And so he leads a church split out in the 1880s. And then eventually Kuyper and Bavinck worked together to bring some of the churches that left in the Afscheiding together with churches that left when Kuyper led a group out in the later 1890s, I believe. So there's some complexity to the Dutch ecclesial life in the 1800s. You're touching on one of the other things that I teach, which is Christian Reformed Church history. And the Christian Reformed Church history is actually deeply embedded into what's going on in the Netherlands in the 1800s. And so, yeah, they definitely do. They're part of that. There are movements within the Dutch National Church that are trying to bring revitalization and new vibrancy and want to stay within the Dutch National Church. And then there's also these movements that start to secede from the Dutch National Church. And Bavinck is born into one of those churches of the secession, and Kuyper is a pastor in the Dutch National Church and then eventually leads a group out.
That's interesting. So Bavinck, he's in this kind of newer denomination, for lack of better words. And then Kuyper's in the old church, still in the National Church. And yet they become really close. So like how does their friendship happen with them kind of living in different worlds?
Yeah, and so Kuyper is older than Bavinck. And so Bavinck actually looks up to Kuyper and is somebody who appreciates Kuyper and really is excited about the kinds of things that Kuyper is encouraging in Dutch national life and really trying to revitalize Calvinism and talk about it as this broad, really all-encompassing world and life view. When I use that term, I'm not just using it intellectually within the context of Neo-Calvinism. Sometimes I think people think worldview is just about the intellectual engagement, but for Bavinck and Kuyper, it's really this full, all-encompassing idea of what it means to live life in light of who God is. And so Bavinck really looks up to Kuyper, and then eventually I think you're getting me into some places that are less fresh in my mind. So there might be a Bavinck scholar who's listening to this alongside of me and being like, this is not a true fact. But from my memory,
yes,
I'm pretty sure that some of the first correspondence that they have is in and around Bavinck does an update on something called the Leiden Synopsis of Pure Theology, which was one of the main texts in the early, really post-Reformation era in the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. And so Bavinck doesn't do an update, but they're going to reprint an edition of this, and he does the work on that edition. And so they start to contact each other and connect with each other over that. And then eventually, Bavinck gets drawn into the orbit of Kuyper and what's going on with the Neo-Calvinist movement as somebody who's very interested in what's going on and sort of a leading theologian in that movement as well. And so they do become kind of, a lot of times people will think of like Kuyper's the front man and Bavinck's the back man, but that's not really how it worked with the Neo-Calvinist movement in the 19th century. But there's definitely a sense in which Kuyper is older and more active at first, and then Bavinck comes along and joins, and then they both become leaders in the movement. For a long time, there is a deep kind of cohesion between them, but there does start to become some fraying later on. And I think, Bavinck because he's such an erratic figure and somebody who's very cautious to sort of throw punches, there's not a lot of public ways in which that shows up, but there is some private disagreements that start to occur. And I would still say that they would still probably present themselves as promoting Neo-Calvinism and developing it, but there's also some disagreements that occur between the two of them as things move on.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's interesting that they even though there was an age gap, they die within a year of each other.
They do. Yeah. So, and I even think this isn't something original to me, but in James Eglinton's biography, he really makes a point of the difference. You can see the difference between Bavinck and Kuyper in the way in which their death is approached. Kuyper's is this big event. He has a face mask made of himself, which is a very common thing to do in the upper echelons of society in that day, a death face mask. And it's a very public death. And Bavinck's is very quiet. And Bavinck does die younger, which is sad to all of us who wish that he wrote more. I think there would have been some really beautiful things that would have come out had Bavinck continued to write. But yeah, I think they do die very closely together, which if you don't look at their birth dates, makes them seem like they're the same age.
Yeah, right. Well, that's great. That it's a helpful kind of context for what the Neo-Calvinist movement was and how these two main figures were really connected to each other. So for the rest of our time together, I thought we would just spend time focusing in on Bavinck, because I know that's your area of specialty, and focusing kind of on the political moment of the day. I know that I listened to another podcast by the Center for Pastoral Theologians that you were on, and you were talking about how Bavinck's thought affects political theology. And so I was wondering if we could just explore that. We're living in a very, obviously we're living in a very difficult time in our country. I mean, we're recording this on the Wednesday after Donald Trump was almost assassinated. And the Wednesday after J.D. Vance has been nominated as the vice president candidate. And at the same time, even just this morning, the New York Times is like breaking the announcement that Joe Biden is possibly thinking about is more open to stepping out of the race now. And, this kind of idea. So it's a very fraught time for politics in our country. And of course, at a personal level, amongst, every common person who doesn't live in Washington, D.C. or is involved in politics, it's a time of high conflict where we're battling with each other over a variety of topics. But it's often about like, how left are you or how right are you? And then it starts to become this big conflict all the time. And a lot of topics get thrown into these categories. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your about your work on Bavinck, and especially in relation to this the political atmosphere we find ourselves in.
Yeah. I wish that I had a real easy answer.
Oh, of course, yeah.
It's definitely, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that it is a tough time to engage in political life. And I think there's a lot to lament in our current context, and the ways in which we treat each other and the ways in which polarization has made conversation really difficult. But one thing that I've been working on, particularly in relation to some of the work I do at the Center for Pastor Theologians, I'm hopefully, Lord willing, speaking at their conference this fall called Kingdom Politics, and trying to think through how does Bavinck help us think about political engagement as Christians. And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is what is the mode of our political engagement? And I talk in that podcast that you mentioned a little bit about Bavinck helping us think about what it means to engage the mode of our engagement being a pilgrim engagement. And Bavinck, in one of his articles on Imitation of Christ, has a little bit of an aversion to this language of pilgrim, but I think that it still fits. There's some ways in which it can still fit what it means to engage political life. And I think one thing that can sound like what you're saying when you're like, oh, engage it as a pilgrim who is, you can think about it as, oh, this world is just something I'm passing through on the way to the new heavens and the new earth. God will renew the whole thing. So who cares but I think that's the opposite of what actually Neo-Calvinists are telling us to do.
I'm thinking of all kinds of old school hymns right now.
Right? Yeah. I have the same thing. Because I think one of the temptations, and maybe this is just a temptation that I feel in today's climate, is to just be like, I'm just out. Like, I don't want to care about it. I know I have to. I know that the decisions that are made, the election results that happen, the polarization that's happening can really impact me and all of us. But I think there's such a temptation to just wipe your hands of the whole thing and to not get involved because it's messy. Because even if you think, okay, I'm not going to get involved in this polarization thing, I think that there's a lot of messiness now, because one of my hypotheses right now is that it's so hard to engage with one another because once we learn one thing about somebody, we assume everything else is involved in the same thing. So if you say that you're anti-abortion, it also means all these other things. If you say, you're pro-immigration, it means all of these other things. And so it's hard to say, actually, this is my nuanced view of the world, and these are the challenges that we face. And so I think that makes political engagement really hard. But I do think that the ways in which Bavinck and Kuyper talk about the reality that Christ is Lord over all things, his lordship matters in every area. And that doesn't mean for them that we bring that lordship there. They are not dominion theologians. They're not into saying, hey, we're going to make the kingdom of God here now by our actions and usher it in by our work. But they do say God is sovereign. Christ is Lord over every square inch, to use Kuyper's famous phrase.
Hmm.
And that means that we can bear witness to the kingdom as it currently already is here, and as we wait for its fullness yet to come. And so I think because of that, this is a long circular answer
No, this
to
is really good.
your question. But I think because of that, it means I can't pull out. I can't not care.
Mm.
Um, I need to think through, in my particular location, in my particular context, and within the broader American life right now, what is the call on me to engage in this world that God cares about? And one of those spheres is the political sphere. And I think one of their insights too is that the political sphere matters. The ways in which a nation is governing itself, however we want to define nation, really impacts its citizens. It has extreme power to bring in justice and justice. And so I am called upon to care about the nation within which I've been placed and within which I am born. It doesn't mean I'm a nation-only person, but it means God has given me this place to care about. And because I'm a creature who's bound by time and space, this is the place within which I am given to care. And this is the place in which I'm called to figure out, how does my Christianity matter when I walk into the voting booth? And this is the place within which I am. How does it matter how I treat my political, quote unquote, opponents? Should I even call them opponents? Kuyper is a little bit more incendiary when he's engaging with people he disagrees with, which is maybe why personality-wise, I'm a little bit more akin with Bavinck. Sense of, like, how do I appreciate why they care about what they care about? What can I engage with and think through slowly and carefully? I know that we don't have a lot of time all the time, but I think that one of the things that Bavinck encourages us as we think about what it looks like to engage in political life, to bring my Christianity to bear and not strip it when I walk into the public sphere, is what does it look like to listen, to be attentive, to say, what is the deep things of life that people are grappling with, that are bringing about the ways in which they are acting in the world. It doesn't, and I think this is something I love about Bavinck, it doesn't mean you ultimately agree with the results, but it means you take the time to care about, what is it about being human that somebody is so drawn to this kind of solution in the world today? What is it touching on that's like restless in the human soul? And I think a lot of times, like, there's a beautiful, you can interrupt me at any point, but there is a beautiful chapter in Bavinck's Wonderful Works of God called Man's Highest Good. And this, maybe even to draw us back to things about, like, thinking about engaging the political life in pilgrim mode. He talks about God and God alone as man's highest good. And he talks about the disaster that comes when we try to find the highest good in something that's not God. It's a very Augustinian argument that he's making. And yet what he does is he says, once, and again, very Augustinian, once you have God as your highest good, these other things are beautiful gifts of human life. The arts, science, social life, all these things are beautiful gifts of human life. And so as pilgrims in this world, as people who are bearing witness to the already nature of the kingdom of God, waiting for the final day, like a pilgrim does, we are on our way to somewhere. This is not the final state of things. We wait for a new renewed heavens and renewed earth for Bavinck and Kuyper, and that will come at a cataclysmic change. And yet, we are also called, as we see God as our highest good, to then engage in the life that God has given us, which is to engage in social life with one another, to engage in the political realm, and to do that in a way that's caring for the humans that are a part of it. because they are part of God's creation. So I'll stop and let you maybe pick a question somewhere in there, because I think, yeah, it covered a lot of ground. But those are some of the things I've been thinking about and how Bavinck can help us today.
That's helpful. I want to hone in on the difference between what you said was dominion theology and Bavinck's and Kuyper's kind of take on it, because I think in the American landscape, some politicians actually have quoted Bavinck, and I think misquoted him many times, or not Bavinck, I shouldn't say, but they've quoted Kuyper as kind of like this, like, well, every square inch is God's. But I think they're getting at the dominion theology you're talking about. Can you just tease that out a little bit?
Yeah, I'll try to tease it out more quickly than the last answer that I gave you. But I think one of the things that we need to do when we read Bavinck and Kuyper is recognize that they are writers of a different era. And so they will talk about things like a Christian nation, which is often what I think gets taken up. Not only the claim of Christ's lordship, but this idea of maybe saying something like a Christian nation. And then we think about that in today's context, and that means, making the nation have a sort of dominion theology of claiming this space for Christ and making everybody be a Christian, or at least subscribe to Christian principles, and then legislating particularities of Christian morality around like the claim to that Christ has dominion over this, so we have claimed it for our own. And I would say
it's kind of like what was it in Louisiana, the recent ruling that all public school classrooms have to have the 10 Commandments? That's kind of an example of that.
That'd be a good, I think that would be an example of that. There's a sense to which they want the magistrates to enforce through law Christianity, and to punish things that are not Christian. And that's the far end of it. Also this sense of like reclaiming America as a Christian nation, whatever that might mean to very particular people. But with Bavinck and Kuyper, they want to argue that actually one should not strip what they think most deeply about the world when they enter into the political realm. But they also want to argue that actually Christianity itself, a Christian vision of politics, is actually the thing that allows for diversity and differentiation and plurality within the political world. So they actually argue from their Christian basis that we should allow for diversity of voices, that there should be allowed for what might be called a principled pluralism in the public sphere, that people are allowed to bring the things that they hold most deeply into the political space. And then we have a dialogue around those things. And so for Kuyper and Bavinck, it's not a top down. I think a lot of the Christian nationalist or Christian dominion theology is very top down. For them, they because they believe Christianity provides the deepest flourishing for human life, they long for what they call maybe a churched nation, a place within which Christian morality and Christian values are a part and parcel of our lives together, but it's not a top-down system. And in fact, the ways in which we think about loving our neighbors, the ways in which we think about not bearing false testimony against our neighbors, is to appreciate the deepest things that they hold about the world, and then to also allow them to live into that. And allow sounds like, oh, we're going to allow you, but to say actually within these spaces, we're going to promote the ability to create a school that teaches your religious tradition or the philosophical worldview out of which you come. And so it actually creates more of a pluralistic public space if you follow the line of Neo-Calvinist political thought down the line than some dominion theology would, which is very top down and very against sort of diversity within the political sphere.
And that's plays out for Kuyper in that he was a main proponent of creating the education system in the Netherlands that I think is still today, the sense
Hmm.
that government funding goes not only to public schools, but it goes to, and not only to Christian schools, but it goes to any religious school is always allowed to get government funded because of his principles that he put in place. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And that's a huge part. So if listeners don't know, Kuyper was actually prime minister in the Netherlands. And
Hmm.
so neo-Calvinist political thought isn't just sort of like abstract theory. It actually was put into practice
Yeah.
in the Netherlands. And he was a part of the implementation of that exact system, which is still in existence in the Netherlands today. Also, this idea that political parties should represent what you hold most deeply to be convicted. So it's a very different political system in the
Hmm.
Netherlands,
Yeah.
which is why it's also hard when we think about what does it mean then to join a political party when you only really have ostensibly two options. And
Hmm.
you're always going to have to compromise something about what you hold most deeply about the world as you enter into the deep political life of a particular party in the US.
Yeah.
So yeah, it can create some interesting questions as you start to try to um, translate what Kuyper and Bavinck were able to do in the Netherlands to a different political system in the States.
Yeah. I think it's a great example of at least one of my takeaways from Kuyper and Bavinck is that um, the Christian should always wield his or her power for the good of the whole community,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, not just for the good of a particular group, but for the welfare of the people. And in the sense of like, it reminds me a bit of like Jeremiah and the Israelites in exile, that they are called by God to seek the good of the city. And I
Mm-hmm.
feel like, you know, Kuyper was far from perfect, but obviously, but there was an impulse there that he was showing a kind of Christianity that was not out for just itself or some kind of world domination. It was
Mm-hmm.
out to, God is going to take care of what people he draws into his fold as Christians. But what I'm called to is to serve this world wherever he has me. And I think that's kind of it's like they were living in a real posture of like God's sovereign over all of this. So what has he had me? What task has he given me to help this world? Yeah.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that, and I think you're right on about that insight of the Jeremiah passage, which actually is very prevalent in a lot of neo-Calvinist literature,
Hmm.
that we are called to seek the welfare of the city. And I think that's an interesting place too to draw it into because it's when the Israelites are in exile. And this is something that appears as you look through a lot of, after Bavinck and Kuyper, this passage from Jeremiah of planting gardens and caring for the city within which you've been placed is a call to care for one's neighbor in a
Mm-hmm.
deep and beautiful way that's very complex. And this is something I also like about Bavinck and Kuyper. It's like it's not either spread the gospel or care about the welfare of the city. It's both.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this thing of saying, how do I care for my neighbor? And this, I think it also associates this idea of common grace in Kuyper and Bavinck, which is a post-fall reality that God maintains and sustains and is at work in those who are not believers. And yet there are goods that they offer to the world. And if God is at work in the world and caring for it, he has also called us to do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this posture of care. And it's this posture of saying, how does the world within which I understand God at work, how do I understand the relationship? What does it mean when I think about what it means to be human? And then to legislate accordingly, not in a dominion sense, but to say, this is what brings flourishing to human life. And there are ways in which governments can bring flourishing to human life. And there are ways in which governments can diminish the flourishing of human life. And so it's our call then, at caring for the welfare of the city, the places within which we've been placed, to think about those things in rich and nuanced ways. So yeah, I think I really appreciate your like insight and appreciation there too, because I feel the same way when I think about Bavinck and Kuyper.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Gayle. We're running up on our time now, and I think that's a great place to finish up. Thanks for kind of giving us a peek into the world of Neo-Calvinism. My church here in Palo Alto comes out of that tradition, but I think we don't always understand kind of the nuances of where we've come from. And so I think it's helpful. I really appreciate, someone like you who's doing work at Dordt. We've had other guests who've talked on Neo-Calvinism in particular, and it's really just an important conversation for us to continue to have. So I really appreciate it, and especially I appreciate your willingness to talk about kind of this political lens, because it's such a difficult conversation in our climate today.
Mm-hmm.
But this is. What I appreciate about this conversation is that it's like trying to get after some of those nuances of what Christians can think about when they think politically, and I think it's a great example of how those nuances only come out as you have longer conversations with one another, like the sound bites, the tweeting, the quick post or message is not enough for these kind of conversations. We have to have longer conversations with our fellow Christians about it. And then hopefully, we can really get to know, like you said, what are those fundamental realities of being human that they are reacting to in their political choices. And perhaps that can help us find a way forward to continue to love those that we find difficult to love. So thank you again so much for being on the show today. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's been wonderful.
Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast. You are who this podcast is for. So please take a moment to like or subscribe, as well as share this episode with a friend. We want more people to hear these great conversations. As you process this conversation about faith and politics, my prayer is that you would know the overwhelming love of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. May you know that He is sovereign over all things and will never abandon His children. And may His Spirit fill you with all joy, grace, and love. Until next time, take good care.